these bombers need fighter protection. Fighter planes are there to protect the bombers, and they don't have much fuel. And the Messerschmitt 109E, the MEL, as the model is of 1940, is the mainstay of the German fighter force in the summer of 1940. And they don't have much fuel, so they need to conserve their fuel, which means they need to be as close to Britain as they possibly can, which is why the majority of them are all in airfields which are hastily created in July 1940 following the fall of France in the Pas-de-Calais, which is the closest point. That's where the channel is its narrowest and all the rest of it, and also in the northern Normandy. And that's where they're flying from. But what that means is that even if you're completely rubbish at bombing, which the British are in 1940, they haven't developed those navigational aids that create untold accuracy by the end of the war. 1940, they don't have that luxury. It's a target-rich environment. I mean, you can barely miss if you go over to the Isle of, over to the Pas-de-Calais. I mean, it's just like one huge, great kind of hub of fighter airfields. And consequently, that means that every single German squadron, which only is 12 airplanes strong on establishment, and very often even fewer than that, always has to leave 2 airplanes behind to defend their own airfields. And it's really interesting when you look at kind of prisoner of war statements from Luftwaffe ground crew that have been downed. They're all bugged in a holding place called Trent Park. You can see the transcripts of these conversations. They're all going about how annoying it was that the RAF are over every night and they can't sleep. And, if only they'd just shut up and leave them alone and not bomb them. This is just part of the narrative of the Battle of Britain that's completely left out. It's always the stocky, the plucky few against the kind of the Nazi hordes and all the rest of it. And it's a complete misnomer. And by that time, aircraft production in Britain is massively outpacing the Germans. And the best ratio that the Germans achieve in 1940 is July 1940, when the British produced 496 new Hurricanes and Spitfires single-engine fighters, and the Germans only produced 240 single-engine fighters. That's the best ratio. And of course, that is the British outproducing the Germans 2-1. And what that means is by the end of October 1940, when the Battle of Britain is sort of, officially designated as being over, the single-engine fighter force of the Luftwaffe is less than 200 from 750 or whatever it was in the beginning of July, whereas the British fighter force had been 650 or whatever at the beginning of July, is now well over 750.
And Britain is outproducing.
Yeah, but to a massive degree. And that continues. And, that is a ratio that just increases as the war progresses. I mean, Britain produces 132,500 aircraft in the Second World War. America produces 315,000.
So why is there this legend of the Luftwaffe?
Well, because it's the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg.
So it has to do with the Blitzkrieg.
It's sort of to do with the Blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe becomes the kind of the bogeyman of the Third Reich. They're blamed for everything, but that's because they're completely abused. They're the only part of the Third Reich's armed services, the only part of the Wehrmacht being the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force, that is in constant use the whole time, or constant abuse, I should say. In Britain and America, they rotate their pilots really, really carefully. By the time you've got the 8th Fighter Command, for example, part of the mighty 8th, the 8th Air Force operating in Britain. By the end of 1943, you would have in a squadron that would have 60. You would never have more than 16 airborne from a squadron at any one time. You would have 40 to 45 pilots to service 16 in the air, and similar number of aircraft, which means you're not overusing these guys. And what would happen by that stage of the war, by 1943, a young fighter pilot coming to a Thunderbolt squadron or a Mustang squadron, for example, at the end of 1943, beginning of 1944, he'd have 350 hours of consecutive flying. And because you can train in America, in Florida or California or Texas or wherever, you can process many, many more people because the training is much more intense, because you've got clear skies. So it's not a question of we'd like to take you out Fritz this morning, but it's a bit cloudy and the RAF are over, or if air forces are over, so we can't fly today. So in Germany, pilot training is constant, aircrew training is constantly being interrupted by the war, by shortage of fuel, by inclement weather, etc., etc. In America, you have none of those problems. And Britain, because of its global reach, also has training bases in what was Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Canada as well. And so you're able to process these guys much better. You're able to give them more training. So that when they come, they're absolutely the finished article as pilots. What they're not the finished article as is, say, a bomber pilot or as a fighter pilot. But that's okay, because you join your squadron of 40 other guys for 16 Airborne, and the old hands kind of take you up a few times. So you arrive at, I don't know, let's say some airfield in Suffolk in East Anglia in England, and you'll have 10 days to 2 weeks acclimatizing, getting used to it. The old hands will put you through your paces, give you some tips. You can pick their brains during kind of while you're having some chow, and listening on some briefings. Then the first mission you do will be a milk run over to France, where the danger is kind of pretty minimal, and you can build up your experience. So that by the time you're actually sent over on a mission to Berlin or Bremen or the Ruhr or whatever, you're absolutely the business. So qualitatively and quantitatively, you are just vastly superior to anything the Luftwaffe's got. The Luftwaffe by that stage, in contrast, 1940, new pilots coming to frontline squadrons with 150, 170 hours in their logbooks, less than 100, 90, 92 hours, something like that. It's not enough. Mm-hmm. And they're just being flung straight into battle, and they're getting absolutely slaughtered. And they're also, because their machines are quite complicated, there's no two-seaters really. So no two-seater trainers. So the first time you're flying in your Focke-Wulf 190 or your Messerschmitt 109, it's this horrendous leap of faith for which you, as a young, bright Luftwaffe fighter pilot, know that you're not ready for this. And it can bite you. Something like a Messerschmitt 109 has a very high wing loading. So it's very maneuverable in the air, but it's got these tiny wings. It's got this incredible torque, this Daimler-Benz DB605 engine with its huge amount of torque, and it just wants to flip you over. So if you're not used to it, and it's got a narrow undercarriage as well, if you're not used to it, you could just crash. So in the first couple of months of 1944, they lose something like 2,400 aircraft in the air and pilots, and about 3,400 are accidents.
So it has to do with training, really.
Yeah.
Not training enough.
It's training and resources and supply. And the Second World War, more than any other conflict, is a war of numbers. There are differences, the decisions that generals can make. There are moments where particular brilliance and bravery can seize the day, take the bridge, hold the enemy at bay or whatever. But ultimately, you're talking about differences which might make a month's difference, 6 months difference, maybe even several years difference. But ultimately, there was a certain point in the Second World War where the outcome is absolutely inevitable, because the guys that lose can't compete with the numbers that the guys are going to win at.
So in that sense, you could think of World War II as a battle of factories.
Yes.
What does it take to win in the battle of factories, in out manufacturing military equipment against the Allies?
It's efficiency, really. So I was kind of, I was thinking, let's take the example of the Sherman tank, for example, the mainstay of the Western Allied forces, and a fair number of them sent to the Soviet Union as well, for that matter.
I think you've said it doesn't get the respect it deserves, maybe?
It doesn't get the respect it deserves. So the Sherman tank, the 75mm main battle gun, is a sort of medium velocity, fire a shell around kind of 2,000 feet per second, compared to the notorious, infamous German 88mm, which can fire at kind of third fast again, like 3,000 feet per second. But on paper, a Tiger tank coming around the corner and a Sherman tank coming around the corner, it should be no match at all. Tiger tank is 58 tons, looks scary, is scary. It's got a massive gun, got really thick armor.
Mm-hmm.
Sherman tank doesn't have as thick armor, doesn't have a gun that's as big. It should be an absolute walkover. And yet, at about 5:30 p.m. on Monday, the 26th of June 1944, a Sherman tank came around the corner of a road called a Rue Monsieur, a little village called Fontenay-le-Pesnel in Normandy, came face to face with a Tiger tank and won. How does this happen? Well, I'll tell you how it happened, because the commander of the Sherman tank was experienced, had one up the spout. So what I mean by that is he had an armor-piercing round already in the breech. As soon as he saw the Tiger tank, he just said, fire. That armor-piercing round did not penetrate the Tiger tank. It was never going to. But what it did do is it hit the gun mantlet, which is a bit of reinforced steel that you have just as the barrel is entering the turret. And that caused spalling, which is the little shards of little bits of molten metal, which then hit the driver of the Tiger tank in the head. And he was screaming, Gott Himmel or whatever, and couldn't really see. The moment they got hit, the commander of the Tiger tank retreated into the turret of the Tiger. The moment you retreat into a turret, you can't see. You can see because you've got periscopes, but your visibility is nothing like as good as it is when you've got your head above the turret. Immediately after that, the armor-piercing round from the Sherman tank was repeated by a number of high explosive rounds, which are rounds which kind of detonate, have a little minor charge. Then there's a second charge which creates lots of smoke, and in moments, in the first 30 seconds, 10 rounds from that Sherman tank had hit the Tiger tank before the Tiger tank had unleashed a single round itself, and the crew then surrendered. So you didn't need to destroy the Tiger tank. You just need to stop it operating. If it hasn't got a crew, it's just a chunk of metal that's inoperable. So that's all you need to do. And what that tells you is that experience counts, training counts. The agility of the Sherman tank also counts. It's a smaller shell, therefore it's easier to manhandle, which means you can put more in a breech quicker. There's features on a Sherman tank, like it's the first tank to have a gun stabilizing gyro, which means it's more effective on the move. There's also an override switch on the underside of the turret, so that the commander, if he just sees something out of the corner of his eye, can immediately start moving the turret before the gunner, who is down in the belly of the turret, can react. There's many different facts of it, but the main fact of all is of 1,347 Tigers built, there were 49,000 Shermans. So that means there's 36 Shermans to every single Tiger.
So you actually have an incredible video. You talk about this a lot from different angles, about the top 5 tanks and then the bottom 5 tanks of World War II. I think, was it the Tiger that made both the top 5 and the bottom 5?
The problem with the Tiger tank is it's really huge.
Which to say that you keep saying the problem, but one of the pros of the Tiger tank,
it's really huge.
It's, the psychological warfare aspect of it is terrifying.
Yes.
So I don't know what the other pros. I guess the 88 millimeter
high velocity and all the rest of it. It's pretty fearsome, but there are pragmatic problems. The big problem is the Germans are incapable of mass production on a scale that Americans can do. Frankly, even the British can do. They're just not in that league. The reason they're not in that league is because they're in the middle of Europe. They don't have access to the world's oceans. They don't have a merchant fleet. They can't get this stuff. It hasn't gone terribly well in the Soviet Union. They can't process it, and they're being bombed 24 hours a day. And so all their factories are having to split them all up, and that is inherently inefficient because then having to kind of move different parts around, and you're then having the whole process of having to travel from one place to another to get stuff. You haven't got much fuel. So the consequence of that is that what you do is you think, okay, well, we can't mass produce, so let's make really brilliant tanks. But they've lost sight of what a really brilliant is. Really brilliant to their eyes is big, scary, big gun, lots of armor. But actually what conflict in World War II shows you is that you need more than that. You need ease of maintenance, you need reliability. And the problem with having the bigger the tank, the more complex the Maintenance equipment is, you need a bigger hoist, which then means you need a bigger truck, which then uses more fuel. So, for example, the Tiger tank is so big that it doesn't fit on the loading gauge of the European railway system. So they have to have different tracks to roll onto the wagons that will then transport them from A to B, take them from West Germany to Normandy. Then they have to take them off. Then they have to take off the tracks, put on combat tracks, then move them into battle and hope that they don't break down. The problem is when you start the war, it's not very automotive, and you've only got 47 people for every motorized vehicle in Germany compared to 3 in the United States or 8 in France. Is that you've got lots of people who don't know how to drive. You've also means you haven't got lots of garages and mechanics and gas stations and so on. And so you're then creating an incredibly complex beast, but you want that complex thing to be as simple as you possibly can be. And that's the beauty of the Sherman tank. All those guys in America, they're used to driving stick cars. There's 3 people for every automobile, and that includes the old and children. So almost, every young man knows how to drive. And when you get into a Sherman tank, it's got a clutch, it's got a throttle, the brakes are the steering mechanism. The clutch is where you would expect the clutch to be. It's got a manual shift. You put your foot on the clutch and you shove it into second gear and off you go, or reverse or whatever. And it literally couldn't be easier. Anyone who could drive a stick car could drive a Sherman tank. Seriously. Not everyone can drive a Tiger tank. It's incredibly complex. Really, really is. And that comes with a whole host of problems. And of course, you don't have the numbers. You've got 1,347 of them. You've got 492 King Tigers, which are even bigger. And at a time where you are really short of fuel, and you're really short of absolutely everything. And those shells are huge, and they're harder to manhandle. And weird little things that the Germans do, for all their design genius, the loader is always on the right-hand side. Now, in the 1920s and 19-teens and 30s, children were taught to be right-handed. You weren't allowed to be left-handed. So you were right-handed. So you want to be on the left-hand side of the gun, so you can take the shell from your right and swivel it into the breech from your right side. But the loader in a Jagdpanther or Panther or Tiger is always on the right-hand side of the breech, which is ergonomically makes no sense whatsoever. Why do they do this? I've never found an answer to this. But, so there's all these little things. And as a soldier coming up against, you're an American GI and you're coming up against a Tiger tank, you don't care about the fact that it's difficult to maintain or the problems involved of trying to get it to the battlefield. All you care about is this monster coming in front of you. It's squeaking and clanking away and it's incredibly scary and it's about to blow you to bits. That's all you care about, and quite understandably so. But those who are protracting the war at a higher level, and historians that come subsequently and look at all this stuff, they do need to worry about all these things. I remember the same Georg Thomas, the architect of the Hunger Plan. I found this minutes of this meeting, which I think was either on the 4th of December or the 5th of December 1941. So it's just before the Red Army counterattacks outside Moscow in the winter of 1941. And it's a meeting about weaponry. And this is a verbatim quote. He says, "We have to stop making such complete anesthetic weapons." In other words, we've constantly been building over-engineered and aesthetically pleasing weapons up until this point. And they sort of half manage it, but don't quite.
We could probably talk for many hours about each of these topics. We could talk for 10 hours about tanks. I encourage people to listen to your podcast, World War II Pod. We have ways of making you talk. It's great.
Yeah, we also do. We got a new YouTube channel and website called World War II Headquarters. Mm-hmm. There are lots of walking the ground and videos of that and all sorts of stuff and little explainers of going around tanks and stuff and the weaponry and documents and photographic archives. So the idea is to sort of turn it into a kind of real hub of anyone who's interested in this subject. It's a place where they can go and find out just a whole load more.
I love it. So, like I said, we could probably talk for many hours on each of these topics, but let's look at some of the battles, and maybe you can tell me which jumps out at you. I want to talk to you about the Western Front, and definitely talk about Normandy. But so there's the Battle of Midway.
Yep.
In 1942, which is a naval battle. There's Eastern Front, Stalingrad, probably the deadliest battle in human history. Then there's the Battle of Kursk, which is a tank battle, the largest tank battle in history, probably the largest battle period in history. 6,000 tanks, 2 million troops, 4,000 aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And then that takes us also to the Battle of the Bulge in Normandy, the Italian campaign that you talk a lot about. So what do you think is interesting to try to extract some wisdom from before we get to Normandy? Do you find, as a historian, the Battle of Kursk or the Battle of Stalingrad more interesting? Stalingrad is often seen as the turning point.
Well, I think so. I mean, it's really interesting. So they get through 1941. Barbarossa doesn't happen as the Germans hope it will. The whole point is to completely destroy the Red Army in 3 months, and that just doesn't happen. And I think you can argue convincingly that by, let's say, the beginning of December 1941, Germany is just not going to win. It just can't. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So if you take an arbitrary date, let's say the 15th of June, 1941, Germany at that moment has one enemy, which is Great Britain, albeit Great Britain plus Dominion Empire. Fast forward 6 months to, let's say, the 16th of December. It's got 3 enemies. It's got Great Britain, Dominion Empire, USSR, and the USA. It is just not going to win. For all the talks of wonder weapons and all the rest of it, it's just not going to. It has lost that battle. Having said that, the Soviet Union is still in a really, really bad situation. It is being helped out a huge amount by supplies from the United States and from Britain. Just unprecedented amounts of material being sent through the Arctic or across Alaska into the Soviet Union at that time. It is absolutely staggering how much is committed by Roosevelt and Churchill to try and stem the flow in the Soviet Union, because for all the announcements and the pride that the Soviet Union has about moving factories to the other side of the Urals and stuff, which they do in 1941, huge amounts are overrun intact by the Germans in the opening stages of Barbarossa. I mean, really, colossal losses, huge amounts. So, the grain is gone, coal is gone, entire factories have gone, steel production goes down by 80% in the Soviet Union in 1941 and into 1942. So in 1942, despite the vast amount of numbers of men that they have at their hands, I mean, they create 80 new divisions in the second half of 1941, for example. I mean, Britain never has 80 divisions in the entire Second World War, division being about, rule of thumb, 15,000 men. So, despite that, and that is because Stalin's meddling, the woeful state of the Red Army in 1941, etc., which we've already sort of touched upon. So 1942, it's still in a really bad way, but Germany's in a really bad way too. The attrition it's suffered in 1941, it's winning itself to death in 1941. So it's having these huge great encirclements, like the encirclement of Kiev in September 1941, capturing a further best part of 700,000 Red Army troops, etc. But in the process of doing that, it is constantly being attrited, both in battle casualties, but in also mechanical casualties too. Just can't cope. The scale is just too big. And what happens is, with every moment that the German forces, that ultimate victory slips away, so Hitler's personal handling of the battle increases. And, you can say what you like about him, but he just hasn't had the military training to do that. He might have amazing attention to detail. He might be able to understand, have an enormous capacity to remember units and where they are on a map. But he was only a half corporal in the First World War. He's never been to staff college. He might have read lots about Frederick the Great. I mean, I've read lots of history, but that doesn't mean to say I'd be a competent field marshal. So he is not the right person for the job at all. And he micromanages and he looks at figures and figures and doesn't understand what it's like at the actual front, the coalface. So he's stifling the very thing that made the German army effective, which is the ability to give commanders at the front the freedom on their leash to be able to make decisions and battle command decisions. And he's taken that away from them. So he's basically making them go into battle with decreasing amounts of supplies and firepower, and with one hand behind their back in terms of decision-making process. And that is not a good combination. The other problem is that he decides, rather than going for Moscow in 1942, because basically there's a kind of cooling off period in the winter because of the conditions. But everyone knows, the Soviet Union knows, the Red Army knows that the moment spring comes, there's going to be another offensive, be another major offensive in the summer. That is absolutely as certain as, day following night, etc. The problem that the Germans have is they just don't have enough. They have less than they had when they launched Barbarossa the previous year. The Soviet Union has more. It is better prepared. It knows what's coming now. It's kind of learning some of the lessons, starting to absorb the lessons. Stalin, coincidentally, is pulling back from his very tight leash in the way that Hitler is doing the opposite and increasing his micromanagement and control freakery. And what Hitler decides is, rather than going for Moscow, he's going to go for the oil fields. And this is absolutely insane, because what's going to happen when they get to the oil fields? I mean, does he think really that the Soviet Union are going to let those oil fields come into German hands intact? Even if he does let them get in intact, what are they going to do with that oil? I mean, oil needs to be refined. Where are you going to refine it? They don't have any oil. They don't have many oil refineries. How are you going to ship that oil to where you need it to be in the factories in the Third Reich and into your, process it into gasoline, and then get it and diesel and get it to your U-boats, get it to your tanks, get it to your armored units? How are you going to do that? How do you transport it from the Caucasus, which is a long, long way away from Berlin? How are you going to do that? There's no pipelines. There's only some pipelines. They've been built by American money and American engineering, and they're going backwards towards the Urals, not forwards. They have no more rail capacity whatsoever. They just don't have the oil tankers. So it is absolute la-la land. It is incredible that when you look at the detailed literature that the Germans have, no one is asking this question in the spring and early summer of 1942.
The logistics question in part.
No one is saying, okay, it's great that we're going to go to the Caucasus and get all this oil, but then what? No one is asking that question.
Nor how do you provide resources and feed and the soldiers and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
I mean, it's...
So the case brew, first of all, they get distracted by going into the Crimea, and they go, well, we've got to do that first. So they have to get Sevastopol and the Crimea, which they do. And then they have to push on. And at this point, suddenly looming in front of them is Stalingrad on the banks of the Volga, this city, this industrial city, which has Stalin's name. And Hitler goes, okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to split my forces. So half of you can go south towards the Caucasus and the rest of you can confront Stalingrad. And von Bock, just who's the commander, just goes, that's nuts. That makes no sense whatsoever. You're splitting the mission. So Hitler fires him. So suddenly they get into this assault for Stalingrad. And it becomes this sort of street fight. Street fighting is the worst kind of fighting. I mean, the reason why the Israelis have just blown everything up in Gaza is because otherwise you can't see. You need a field of fire. This is fighting in a build-up area is horrendous.
Yeah, to clarify, we're talking about urban warfare, door to door, building to building.
It's incredibly difficult, and home advantage is colossal in this instance. And of course, it's piping hot when they attack in kind of August into early September, and then it suddenly gets very, very cold. And at the same time, American mechanization and slightly a British mechanization, but primarily American trucks are enabling Zhukov to plan this great pincer movement. So it is, and Russians will hate me for saying this, and I probably will get a whole load of bots on the back of it. But the truth is it is not the street fighting that destroys Sixth Army. It is the encirclement, the subsequent encirclement. So the Germans have been sucked into this street battle in Stalingrad. We cannot give up. We cannot give up. We cannot back down. We cannot pull out. We've got to destroy this city. Meanwhile, while their backs are turned and while most of their forces are going off to the Caucasus on a wild goose chase for absolutely zero oil, incidentally, and they never get remotely close to Baku, this huge great pincer movement is being planned, and it is only possible through mechanization from the United States. And that is the big turning point, because from that moment onwards, the Germans are on the back foot. They're basically going backwards. There are little small counterattacks. There is obviously the Kursk salient, for example, but it's game over. The catastrophe of the surrender of the final. I mean, the writing's on the wall at the end of 1942. But by November 1942, when the two Soviet fronts meet up, then there is no possible chance of escape for Sixth Army. They are consigned. They are toast. And their final surrender obviously happens at the very beginning of February 1943. But that's all over. And then at the same time that is happening, disaster is unfolding in North Africa, because Hitler has insisted on massively resupplying the Mediterranean theatre. And the problem there is the amount of equipment that is lost in North Africa is greater than it is at Stalingrad. I don't think you could argue that psychologically